4. Now with our lesson, Clayton Tune.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
If you got a Bible, go to Matthew 26. Matthew 26, 69. That's going to be where we're going to start. Is anybody doing a yearly Bible reading plan right now? Most people? If you're not, I always encourage you, since it's the beginning of the year, make it a point to read through the Bible. It is extremely important that Christians do this. Not just so we can say we read through the Bible. But God has always intended His people to be smart, to understand God's history. We are to be an educated people. We are called to give an account of our faith, why we believe what we believe. The best place to start is God's Word. If you missed the January 1st date, there are plenty of plans. My wife is doing a 6-month plan. I do a 90-day plan. The 90-day plan is, anybody ever done the P90X or the Insanity workout? That's what it's like. I did the Insanity workout, and I hated it. I didn't hate reading the Bible in 90 days, but that's the kind of thing it is. You really have to commit, but in 90 days you're done. It's a great way to read it, but I highly encourage you, pick a date, find a plan, get through the Bible this year if you've not done it yet. Matthew 26, 69. Now Peter was sitting out in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him. "You were also with Jesus of Galilee," she said. But he denied it before them all. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. Then he went out to the gateway, where another girl saw him and said, "This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth." And he denied it again with an oath. "I do not know that man." After a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, "Surely you're one of them. Your accent gives you away." And then he began to call down curses on himself, and he swore to them, "I do not know that man." Immediately a rooster crowed, and Peter recalled the word that Jesus had spoken, "Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly. I feel incredibly sorry for Peter at this point. I don't feel as sorry for him as I do when I read Luke, because when Luke recounts the story, after that final denial, Jesus looks at Peter, and Peter sees him, and he knows. He knows that Jesus knows he has let down the Lord. This should not have been a surprise to Peter. Jesus had been saying that this was going to happen. In Matthew chapter 16, Jesus told his disciples, "I must go to Jerusalem, I must be arrested by the chief priests and the scribes, I must be killed and on the 3rd day rise again." And Peter responds, "That's not going to happen." And then in this chapter, chapter 26, Jesus told Peter, "Before that rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And what does Peter say? "That ain't never going to happen. If everybody deserts you, I'm going to stay with you. Even if I have to die, I would never deny you." And now, everything that Jesus has said has come about. And nothing Peter has said has come about. After reading this, I'm reminded of a passage in Job that I think may kind of give you some insight into how Peter felt. Job said, this is in chapter 3 of Job, "What I have feared has come upon me. What I dreaded has happened to me. I have no peace. I have no rest. Only turmoil." I don't doubt that Peter felt guilt for his cowardice. But I think Peter felt something even deeper. It's one thing for me to feel bad of something that's reprehensible for me, but it's something else for me to feel bad because what I did has now caused the death of someone else. I didn't have to do that, but I did it. What Peter did not realize, though, at this time was that he was but a player in events of cosmic proportions. And though he is a responsible player in this, he is not a determining player. God is the only determining player. I think this is something that we should keep in mind, not just for Peter, but ourselves. We are players in proportions of this world. And though we are responsible players, we are not determining ones. God is the only determining player. My choice is whether I'm going to live in harmony with God's will or in opposition to it. It's pretty narrow. But fundamentally, what I do and how I act does not in any way alter God's will. God's will is going to happen. It's just how I want to live with it. So Jesus is going to die regardless of what Peter did, regardless of what he said, because everything is happening in this part of the story throughout the whole time as a part of God's will. What's funny is, well, if you notice as you go through this story, here's what's weird. Up until this point, the chief priests have said, we are not going to get him during the Passover. There are too many repercussions. We have political repercussions. The people will be against us. They will oppose us, not to mention our reputation. So we'll just leave it alone until Passover is done. The problem is, God had already decided Jesus is going to die during the Passover. So what happens? The chief priests aren't going to do it. Judas goes. And he says, you want Jesus? I'll give him to you. Nothing has changed in all this. You still got the Passover. You still got all the things that are going to happen. The chief priests are going to go through a lot of stuff to get it. And despite all that, they say, okay, that works. We'll get him during the Passover. What happened? Nothing changed. And I read that and I think, man, God is going to get his way. He's going to have exactly what he wants. Jesus is going to die during the Passover. The chief priests are going to arrest him. That the disciples would scatter. That Jesus would be arrested. All of this stuff was already intended and talked about by God. 7 times in Matthew 26, Jesus reminds his disciples, everything that's about to happen is according to God's will that it happened. You're not going to get away from it. So Jesus is arrested. He's taken to the high priest. And Peter follows now, no longer as a disciple, but as a follower of the crowd. He follows them, well, the Greek text says he follows them to see the end. If you have the NIV of 1984, he follows just to see what's going to happen. But Peter has come to the trial, and the text says that the chief priests looked for false evidence. Now, here's the thing. If you want to cook up some false evidence, you can do that. It doesn't take much work. Now, it has to be believable. I mean, it just has to be something that people will believe and that can pass. But the thing with the chief priests is that they have to find something that is in the law. And if you notice, they have a hard time doing that because they can't find anybody who can agree. They got people who are coming in saying Jesus did this and he said this and he acted this way, but nobody can agree. And finally, when hope is running thin for them, these 2 guys show up and say, this Jesus person that you have, you want to know what he did? He went to the temple and he said, I'll destroy this temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. Did Jesus actually say that? Because if you only... Now, you got to remember, they didn't have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John back then. So when you're getting the book of Matthew, you only got Matthew. John hasn't even come out yet. So if you're reading the book of Matthew and you're looking at the life of Christ and going from your memory and you come to that statement of Jesus said that, what are you going to think? He didn't say that. They've lied. Now, it's true that in John, Jesus does say something like that. He does say, if you destroy the temple, I'll rebuild it in 3 days. But in Matthew, in Mark, and in Luke, that story does not occur. He doesn't say it. He doesn't even say that in John. They've lied. The chief priests say, that's blasphemy. And they bring it to Jesus, take an oath. And what does Jesus do? He stays quiet. I find it weird in all of this, Jesus just stays quiet. He doesn't say a word. Sometimes if you get in trouble, if you just keep talking, you can get out of it. You give people time to rethink things, you give things time to cool down. You can move on from this. But Jesus doesn't say anything. They ask him if he's the Christ. He says, I am. You know why he says I am? Because it's the one answer that's going to speed things up. Let's get it going. They put him on oath, and he doesn't answer a single thing. You charge me however you want to, I'm not answering you. I don't submit to you. They tell him to take an oath. He says, I am. The chief priest tears his robe. He has committed blasphemy. He deserves to die. And the text tells us that the very worst of humanity came forth. They spit in his face. They struck him in the back of the head, asking him to prophesy. Tell us who hit you. While all this is going on, of course, we get back to our text. Peter is outside warming himself by the fire. And someone comes up and says, I know you. You were with him. Wasn't me. He denied it. Somebody else comes, and they say, "Hi, I remember you. You were with that crowd. You were with him." And Peter says, "I swear to God, I was not with that man." He takes an oath. We don't know exactly what he said. By God, by the temple, something. "I promise you, I was not with him." Time goes by and somebody else comes up. In the conversation, they say, "Something about your accent. I know you were with him." Peter takes an oath. And I want you to notice the intensity of it. He calls down curses on himself. What Peter's basically saying is, I want something bad to happen to me if indeed what I'm telling you is false. He has called down a curse on himself. So Peter has placed himself under a curse. It's under a curse of God, and then the rooster crows. And he realizes what he's done. And unlike the chief priest who tears his robe, Peter tears his heart and goes out and weeps bitterly. He's not the only one who's weeping bitterly, though. Surprisingly, there's Judas. Matthew says that Judas was filled with remorse after all this has happened. He took the money that the chief priest had given him, and he brings all the chief priests together, and he says, "Guys, look, I messed this up. I've done something really bad here. I gave a false testimony, and I put an innocent man. I'm helping to put an innocent man to death. Here's that money back. We got to put this back the way it was. We got to fix this. Here's the money. Can we put this back the way it was?" What did the chief priest say? Hey. That's not our problem. We missed the part where that was about us. You did it. Tough. Judas throws the money at him. He walks out. Goes out and takes his own life. By betraying innocent blood, Judas had himself come under a curse. It was a curse of his own doing, but it was a curse of God nonetheless. Because he had testified in a capital trial, he had now perjured himself. And according to the law, God's law, he deserved to die. Judas knows that. And perhaps in an attempt to atone for his own sin, he just takes his own life. It's the only way to pay for that curse is to pay for it myself. I did it. I got to fix it. Now there's the chief priest, though. The text, Matthew tells you they don't really feel any remorse, but they got to feel something, because now they got that money. And they know that they bought that they bought a false confession, and now they got this money to deal with. So what do? They buy a field in which to bury foreigners who come to Jerusalem. They just think, maybe if I do something nice, if I do something charitable, we'll just fix this whole situation. We'll move on from this. But it's not going to fix it. Now, there's not a lot in Matthew about the actual crucifixion. Matthew just says that they took him to the place of the skull, they crucified him, they put this plaque on top of the cross that says, "This is Jesus, King of the Jews," and all the people who are opponents, well, they're shaking their hands and they're raising their fists and they're yelling at him. They're saying, hey, you said you could take down the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, but you can't come down from the cross. You saved others, but you can't save yourself. You said you were the Son of God. How about this? If you really are the King of Israel, you're the Son of God, how about you come down from that cross and I'll do whatever you say? And then in verse 47, verse 43, Matthew says that they said, "He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now, if he wants him." Okay. Those words are a citation from something. Does that sound familiar to anybody? It should not. I would be surprised if it sounded familiar. When you quote something today, if I were to quote something from Shakespeare, if I were to quote something from a movie that we've all seen, I can say a few words and you pick up on it. If you're a Jew in the first century, the Psalms are pretty much in your mind if you study the Psalms. They're like poems today of Shakespeare. When Matthew writes those words, he trusts in God, let God rescue him now if he wants him, he is citing a psalm. Psalm 22. If you know the Psalms, Psalm 22 begins as a cry of despair. I was in the depths. I felt like God turned his back on me. But if you know that psalm, you know that that psalm is a psalm of triumph. And Jesus picks up on this from the cross. And what does he respond with? He responds with the first verse of that psalm. my God, why have you forsaken me?" Matthew is pointing you back to this to remind you, hey, you've seen this before. This is a psalm of triumph, and Jesus is going to triumph. And after that, Jesus dies. They take him down, they wrap him in a cloth, and they bury him. His death is signaled by earthquakes and the temple curtain tearing in two and dead people coming out of the ground. That is by far the weirdest thing of this whole account. If I could figure out anything, if I could learn more about any situation, it's the whole thing when the dead people come back, because Matthew's the only one that tells you that. But it's signaled by a lot of very odd stuff. But of all the things that Matthew mentions, these are portents to things in the Old Testament to remind you of the judgment of God. Jesus has died on a cross. God is on his throne. He has judged mankind. This has been foretold. And Jesus is taken down. He is buried. And as I've said many times today, so far, all this is happening for a reason. And despite that it's God's will, everything's turning upside down. Have you ever noticed irony in Matthew's account? Let me give you a few examples. Here you have Jesus, who is, as we know him, the judge of the earth. Here is the creator of the world, the owner of all that we know. Here is Jesus on trial before the justice of the peace. That's upside down. You don't try the owner of the world at the justice of the peace. There's nothing wrong with the justice, but you don't try the owner of the world there. You need a higher court. He is brought before a governor that's not going to govern. Pilate has the authority to change this whole situation, and he ain't going to do it. And meanwhile, the religious leaders are clamoring for his life. And while those people who talked with him, who debated with him, who sat down with him, who watched him do miracles, while those people are clamoring for his life outside, an unnamed Gentile woman speaks up for Jesus' life. That's just backwards. Pilate won't say anything about it. And then you have this Barabbas guy. In old texts, and you won't have it in your Bible. If you do, then you have a very, very, very old Bible. Barabbas is named Jesus Barabbas. Barabbas is a term for a son of the father or a son of the rabbi. So Pilate brings him out and says, do you want Jesus the son of the Father, or do you want Jesus the Messiah? And they pick Jesus Barabbas. Everything is turned upside down in this situation. Pilate, for some reason, claims to be innocent of all that's going on, even though, if he wanted to, he could fix the problem. So, through all of this, God has provided, all of this backwards, all of this ironic events that are going on, God is providing mankind its only way for dealing with sin. Judas tries to deal with his sin by dealing with it himself. I mess it up, I'll pay the price. We do that a lot. I did the crime, I'll do the time. The problem is Judas can't do that. His death cannot pay the price for sin. The chief priests try to atone for their sin by doing what? Doing a charitable act. If I just do enough good work, if I just give enough, maybe I can make up for the bad stuff that I did. That doesn't work either. And Pilate, he just does a ritual cleansing and tries to atone for it by proclamation. I'm just not guilty. I mean, I am. I'm just going to say that I'm not. I mean, if you say something enough, eventually people will just believe you. Shoot, you'll believe you. We must realize that we cannot fix the problem of sin. It takes Christ's death. It takes the death of a God to atone for mankind's sin. It might be today that your life has turned upside down. There is a lot of irony in your life. I want you to know today, you cannot fix the problem yourself. You can't do enough good work to cover it up. And you can't just say, it's fine. In a world ruled by an almighty God, the only way to atone for sins committed against said God are through the means in which that God is given. which will be the blood of His Son. God has freely offered His Son if we are willing to accept. Let's all stand and sing.